This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get 30 days of free documentaries with the link down below.
Hi! I guess you didn't expect to see my face this time, but now you are, and you're welcome. This is my good friend Nate Gentile. He is a tech YouTuber in Spain and actually came to me with a pretty interesting idea.
Nate produces all sorts of fascinating tech-related content in Spanish, and recently he had a video where he analyzed a large range of gaming laptops of different budgets and brands, and on that video he criticized laptops brand as gaming with a GTX 1050 GPU, as he claimed they were okay for games like League of Legends or just office tasks, but might be insufficient for bigger and modern titles. Needless to say, the comments were very explicit in taking an issue at an inflated view of what is needed for gaming. Honestly, if I understand correctly, his criticism was more about the gaming branding on pretty pricey laptops with a GTX 1050, which could potentially trick consumers into buying them thinking they would run every game at every setting, which is not the case. But the GTX 1050 is pretty popular, so he wondered, what sort of gaming could you actually do with the cheapest capable laptop out there? And wouldn't he know a YouTuber that would be just perfect for answering that question?
So he got this piece of work. This is one of the cheapest available laptops with a GTX 1050 that we could find.
This is actually the cheapest I was able to find in every store in Spain.
So there you go. And the question was in there, like, what sort of sacrifices, before we even get into the part of gaming, what sort of sacrifices were needed in order to get a laptop to this price? And for that, I also needed Nate's help and expertise. So what have we been discussing so far?
Well, as you know, recently I've been testing laptops around $1,500, euros actually, not dollars,
Yes.
euros.
They're almost the same anywhere right now, so
yeah. And well, there are a lot of differences. The first one for me is the screen. The colors in this screen are terrible. But I mean, it's something you expect for this price. And actually one thing I liked is that the screen is 1080p.
Yeah, not that very long ago, you will often find laptops at this price range at less than 1080p. That was one of the first things that we'll do to cut price.
Yeah, actually the color resolution here is 6 bits, so it's
Exactly.
less than usual.
So the point that we're trying to say about this, like, this is not a device that is intended for gaming purposes, but and it does make some sacrifices to get there. We made an experiment where we decided to take this thing apart and see what was inside, and we were very surprised to discover that it makes some interesting ideas in order to have like cooling, and it's basically a very small board inside a very large case with a very subpar battery. So it's clearly a model that is meant to cut corners as much as possible. But even with that, it's still pretty usable, isn't it?
Yeah, actually it's pretty weird inside. This case wasn't made for this laptop, I'm pretty sure. This is a generic case they make for many models.
Yeah.
And then they sticked this pretty small motherboard inside here with only one fan.
Yeah.
And pretty basic cooling system, only one heat pipe.
Which works surprisingly well. It doesn't overheat. It achieves the clocks that it's aiming to achieve, and it doesn't really overheat as much as you will expect it to.
Yeah, also the 1050 is not a very hot graphic card, but anyway, it's quite impressive.
And so the question was, for if you're buying a laptop like this for school, if you're buying a laptop like this because you had no other options, because you got a hand-me-down of anything like that, can you actually game on this, and what sort of thing can you expect in terms of performance? And that's why Nate called me to do this sort of experiment. So let's see actually what can we expect there.
Now, obviously the first thing I wanted to get out of the way is that for a laptop with a GTX 1050 and a quad-core, it tends to be sufficient for lighter competitive titles like CSGO or Overwatch, both of which work fine on higher settings for CSGO and medium settings for Overwatch, as long as you're aiming for 60 FPS. It is important to keep in mind that performance at this level tends to depend a lot on thermals, and ultra-thin laptops with similar specs are often configured at lower TDPs, but lucky for us, those tend to be quite pricey. So this cheap device, with its very improvised air channel created by the chassis, does keep things working pretty well. So how do some of the heavier games do? The older GTA 5 did better than I expected, keeping over 60 FPS on medium-ish settings without needing much of a change. And intense multiplayer games like Apex Legends worked fine on the low settings for most circumstances. Once we get into the realm of stuff like Devil May Cry 5, we say goodbye to full 1080p gaming and start playing around with the render resolution slider if you want to keep to 60 FPS, and it definitely can keep it on those levels. Even for newer, much heavier stuff, the 1050 does great in lower resolutions and lower settings without any tweaks. On Nate's video, Pubg was one of the games we discussed, which achieved pretty good frame rates but was unable to do full 60 FPS at 1080p with a 70% resolution scaler. Pubg's optimization has improved a great deal over the last few years, but it is still far from a light game. But there are alternatives. In the past, I made a video about Pubg Lite, a report of Pubg Mobile but made for PC, making it a version of Pubg with all its basic features, but that has some really low requirements. While it does not look nearly as good as a PC version, Pubg Lite works at 60 FPS, full 1080p at medium settings just fine. If you're in love with the idea of Battle Royale but your PC is consistently too weak to play Pubg, this free-to-play version is a fantastic option. Its only real problem is that it's region-locked. They have been dramatically expanding its country list, but if you're outside that area, you will need a VPN. I tested a ton of games, so if you want to see the full breakdown of those results or want to see more clips of the unexpected internals of the laptop on a disassembly, I will point you to Nate's channel. I know the large majority of the viewers of the channel will not understand Spanish, but I'm working with him to get subtitles on that video. This is a multi-language collab. Welcome to Weird Multicultural 2019 YouTube. To be honest, I tested many games and was hard-pressed to find something that will not work, at least on a lower resolution scale without any settings. With that said, there were a couple of interesting cases. Far Cry 5 was perfectly able to keep a 30 FPS lock at 1080, with some stuttering due to only having 2 gigs of VRAM and a fair deal better at 70%, but not exactly 60 FPS, so I wondered exactly what was limiting it and what it will take to achieve full frame rate. I did a video explaining some of the very dramatic stuff that you can do to Far Cry 5 graphics in order to squeeze maximum performance, like reducing all details and draw distances to a minimum, and even with that I was only able to achieve 60 FPS on a 80% resolution scale of 1080. It's not bad, but everything over that will overflow the VRAM and tank performance. Not very useful to play like this, I will admit, but an interesting experiment nonetheless. A maybe more interesting example is Nier Automata. I often use this game as a GPU benchmark because even on the lowest settings its global illumination is very computationally expensive. Thankfully, there's a way to fix that in the shape of the Fix Nier Automata mod that allows us to reduce the number of samples used or disable the illumination entirely, which can cause the game to look a bit odd sometimes, but nets an important performance boost. I talk more about that on my video in the corner and description. The humble 1050 PC is surprisingly good on Nier Automata 2, at least on a scene where not much is going on. By using the mod to disable the global illumination, the FPS jumps enough that combat is still over 30 FPS at all times, which is absolutely great for this highly recommended game. The one game that gave me trouble at all levels is Wolfenstein-the The New Colossus. This Vulkan-only game can be quite heavy and is murder on any GPU with only 2 gigs of VRAM. To make it somewhat functional on this PC, I had to do several things. Lowest settings, an internal resolution scaler set to 50%, game resolution set to 960 by 540, which I added with the program link in the description. Then, I used the console command from my Wolfenstein-the video to disable most of the shadows, and only then the game was even remotely playable. While I do recommend these extreme measures if you want to play this game no matter what, this obviously represents a limit on what this laptop can achieve. Although, as I said on this video, there's a lot of games that you can play before arriving there, so this makes for a rather competent general use laptop. Just don't buy a gaming device with RGB and such if all it has is a GTX 1050. Instead, get a cheaper multimedia PC like this one if you can, and it will probably do just fine. But you know what's also a great use for a multimedia PC? Watching documentaries on CuriosityStream, this video sponsor, and this time there's a new surprise. For those who have not heard before, CuriosityStream is a streaming service with over 2,400 documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals, and probably the best cure for your boredom, because things here get very interesting. For example, this week I have been watching Witches, A Century of Murder, a deep dive into the horrifying practice of witch hunting, which led to the torture and death of thousands of women. It's a surprisingly interesting look at a very horrifying part of history, and kind of a good fit for this spooky month. Now the new surprise here is that if you subscribe to CuriosityStream, you also get access to a little thing called Nebula. So YouTube is great, but when you're trying something dramatically new or certain topics, it has a tendency to bury your content, demonetize you, or otherwise use the algorithm to make your life difficult. You have heard other creators speak about this, so you know what I'm talking about. This is why a group of creators, including myself, have slowly been working on building up an alternative for a new, unique content platform in the form of a subscription service called Nebula. This is still in early stages, and we have been slowly uploading our backlog, but there are already original experiments, like how Real Life Lore and Second Thought join forces to do a show where they review cars called Grand Theft Auto. Very clever. And the good thing is that if you use the link in the description, the CuriosityStream subscriptions will include a Nebula subscription with no change in price. So if you use the link curiositystream.com/LowSpecGamer in the description, you get 30 days free of both. And only if you use the link in the description, then both Nebula and CuriosityStream are $2.99 a month. I cannot express how much CuriosityStream is doing to support our creator community, so show them some love. Thank you to them, to Nate, and to you for watching all the way here.
No se me ocurrió, me parece que esté montado por terroristas, tío, por dentro. ¿Sabes? En plan... Pero suda, no lo voy a decir.